Good evening, everyone, and welcome to another Torah portion study. This week we study the portion of Beahalotcha. It's the third portion in the book of Numbers, Bamidbar. We will begin with the start of the portion, and in the Chumash, in the book that we study, you may find it on page 910. If you follow with the text from the Bible, we are on Numbers, the book of Numbers, chapter 8, verse 1. The Torah begin. God spoke to Moshe saying, I'm reading from the text. Speak to Aaron and say to him, when you fire up the lamps of the menorah, the wicks should be angled so that 7 lamps cast their light towards the center lamp of the menorah. Aaron did so precisely. He fired up the lamps so the wicked were towards the center lamp of the menorah, as God had commanded Moshe. To summarize, God commands Moshe to teach Aaron to light up the menorah in a particular way, and Aaron followed the instruction to the T and dot. The Torah continues. This is the construction method of the menorah. It is a hammered work of gold from a single piece of metal. It is a single hammered piece from its large base to its delicate flowers. He constructed the menorah resembling the vision that God had shown Moshe at Mount Sinai. And this is the story of the construction of the menorah. God tells Moshe to teach Aaron how to light the menorah and shares with us the order and the construction of the menorah that had to be hammered out of one single piece of metal of gold, and all the details must be hammered out of the same gold nugget and not just adding pieces to build the menorah. Everybody's asking, what does menorah have to do in the book of Numbers? We already discussed the menorah priorly in the book of Exodus with all the details. Why suddenly God is instructing Moshe to build and how to light the menorah? It seemed to be totally out of place. The answers are, I'm going to share several answers and go back to the Rebbe's understanding. Rashi answers that last week we concluded the portion with the altar dedication by the 12 different tribes. Each leader of a tribe dedicated the altar by bringing a particular number of sacrifices every single day. On the 1st of Nisan, starting at the 1st until the 12th day of Nisan, that included 12 tribes except the Levite tribe. They were not invited to dedicate the altar. Says Rashi, Aaron got upset. He was unhappy that he was not offered to dedicate the altar like the other leaders of the other tribes. And God turned to him and said, don't worry, you will dedicate the temple by lighting the menorah. And because the menorah is part of the temple, you dedicate the temple by lighting the menorah every single morning upon entering the tabernacle, the temple of God. This is Rashi. The Nachmanides, Ramban, is asking 2 questions on Rashi. The first question is asking, why console Aaron with the lighting of the menorah? After all, the lighting of the menorah can be done with anybody. In fact, by Jewish law, lighting of the menorah in the temple can be done by an Israelite. If an Israelite stands outside the temple and he extends a stick, a torch, with flame, he's allowed to light the menorah. He's not allowed to enter the temple, the hall of the temple, but he's allowed to stay outside and light the menorah. So lighting of the menorah is not unique to Aaron. It is allowed by any Kohen and is allowed even by Israelite. Why shouldn't he console Aaron by a sacrifice that he had to bring every morning? Every day Aaron, the high priest, upon entering the temple, were to bring, was obligated to bring a sacrifice to God. Also, he can be consoled by serving God on Yom Kippur and entering the Holy of Holies, which we know is very unique, representing the entire Jewish people. No other human being is allowed to enter. No Kohen is allowed to enter, not even the king. Yet Aaron is the only one who is allowed to. God chose to console Aaron with menorah, which is not unique to Aaron. That's question number one. Question number two, the Nachmanides asked, why is Rashi saying that there is a repetition from the book of Exodus? There is no repetition here. In the book of Exodus, it tells us the details of how to build a menorah. Here, the Torah is teaching us how to light the menorah, which is not mentioned in the book of Exodus. Nachmanides explained that God consoled Aaron with the lighting of the menorah, telling Aaron that the lighting of the menorah that Aaron will dedicate will never cease from the history of Jewish people. As we all know, after the second temple was built, the Greeks tried to abolish the temple, and the Maccabees were able to overcome the Greeks and rededicate the temple. And the way they dedicated the temple was by lighting the menorah. And since then, we all light menorahs every single year for 8 days during the holiday of Hanukkah. So God turns to, according to Nachmanides, God teaches Aaron, you know, the leaders of the other tribes dedicated the temple by bringing sacrifices on the altar. The altar is temporary. There will be a time that the altar will disappear and there will be nothing left from the altar. For you, however, dedicating the temple by lighting the menorah can be gone, but it definitely and surely will remain with the Jewish people forever, as there will be anywhere in exile without a temple, Jewish people commemorating the miracle of the Maccabees, which were priests and the grandchildren of Aaron, by lighting a menorah every year for 8 days to symbolize the menorah of the temple. This is Nachmanides. But we can ask, later on, Rashi continues, when we read about the way the menorah was constructed, the text does not tell us who constructed the menorah. The text reads the following: this is the construction method of the menorah. It is hammered work of gold from a single piece of metal. It is a single hammered piece from its largest base to its delicate flowers. Then the Torah continues. He constructed the menorah resembling the vision of God that God have shown Moshe on Mount Sinai. He constructed the menorah. Who is he? Rashi tells us that actually Moshe was unable to create the menorah. It's one of the very few things that Moshe was unable to do. And God told Moshe, just throw the gold nugget, the big piece of metal, into the fire, and miraculously it will get constructed by itself. God constructed it. That's why the Torah don't tell us that Moshe constructed it, or that the Betzalel, the man entrusted of the building of the temple, did it, because they did not. Actually, it was God who constructed the menorah, and that's why the Torah tells us he constructed the menorah. The Rebbe explains in a different way. The Rebbe says that when Aaron was complaining about dedicating the temple, that he was unable to dedicate it with bringing a sacrifice on the altar, Moshe was instructed by God to reward Aaron and tell him that his dedication is far greater with the lighting of the menorah and not about Hanukkah. Says the Rebbe, that's why, because the menorah is much greater than the altar, because the altar was created by Moshe or Bezalel, by human beings following God's plan. The menorah, on the other hand, was not created by a human being, but rather by God Himself. In that way, the menorah is far greater than the altar. So when you have an opportunity to dedicate the temple, the other leaders dedicated it with an altar, bringing sacrifices to the altar. Moshe tells Aaron, your dedication would be by dedicating the menorah, which was created by God Himself. So it's not talking about the future when Hanukkah will happen, and therefore there is no comparison to Yom Kippur or to the sacrifices that Aaron had to bring every morning. It is about the furniture itself, the menorah itself, which was created by God. And by allowing Aaron to dedicate the menorah, God says to him, yours is far greater than theirs. There is one underlying message here, and it plays out later in this week's portion in a few other places, and that is when we feel that we want to come closer to God in a spiritual way, and we demand, why don't we? We are going to receive the gift from God unequivocal. We see that Aaron demanded that he wants to come closer to God by dedicating a temple just like the other leaders. God rewarded them in a far greater way. And the next topic that we're going to be discussing is the story of the second Passover, which we just had a month ago, which was a result of people demanding a spiritual closeness to God. God not only agreed, but He offered them another holiday that became a holiday forever. Later on, we read about other people where when they were demanding for coming closer to God, Moshe tells them, you pray to God and I'll go and ask Him. And as we see, the results are that God is agreeing with them and rewards them for their wishes. And I want to move on to the next topic that is about the second Passover. If you have the book, the Chumash from the synagogue, we are going to page 917, or we're starting chapter 9, verse 1. I'm going to share with you a summary of the story, and then we will get a little bit farther into details for as long as we have. We read about the second year and the first of the month of Nisan, just almost a year after they left Egypt. God ordered Moshe to tell the Jewish people that they must celebrate the Passover holiday again, just as they did last year in the land of Egypt. They must bring a Paschal offering, and they must eat matzah for 7 days and make sure that they are pure before bringing the sacrifice. We read about the fact that the Jewish people did follow and they brought the sacrifice. We also read about a bunch of people, few people, that were impure. They were involved with dead corpse. According to some, they carried the coffin of Yosef. According to others, it was Elitzaphan and his brother, Mishael Elitzaphan, who carried the bodies of Nadav and Avihu, who died in the temple, and they were impure. And they turned to Moshe, demanding that they also want to participate. And Moshe said to them, stand here, which means keep praying to God, and let me ask God what He wants to do. And God says they are correct, and therefore we give them a second Passover. And since then we have Pesach Sheni, the second Passover for those who could not celebrate Passover in the first time. But a lot of fascinating lessons from this story. This is the one story in this week's Torah portion. But we begin. Let's start at the beginning of the story. I'm reading on page 917, verse 9, chapter 9, verse 1. God spoke to Moshe in the Sinai desert in the second year of their exodus from the land of Egypt, in the first month. So again, the Torah tells us when this story occurs, it occurs on the first month of the second year. The commentators ask, if you go back to the beginning of the book of Numbers begin with a story of counting the Jewish people, and the Torah gives us the time when it happened. I'm going to read it to you at page 849, chapter 1, verse 1. God spoke to Moshe in the Sinai desert in the tent of meeting on the first day of the second month in the second year after the exodus from the land of Egypt, saying, take the sum of the entire congregation of the children of Israel. So the beginning of the book of Numbers starts with a story that happened on the second month of the second year. The story that appears in our portion about Passover begins in the first month of the second year, meaning it happens 1 month earlier than the story the book of Numbers opens. And all the commentators, including Rashi, is asking, why shouldn't we begin the book with this story of our portion and then read about the counting of the Jewish people, which happened a month later? After all, it's a very fascinating story about the commandment to continue celebrating the Passover sacrifice as God had instructed them in Egypt. Here is a bunch of answers, and then we'll see something the way the Rebbe understands it, a much deeper layer. Rashi answers two answers. Rashi said, from here we see that the Torah does not follow a chronological order. Stories that appear after may actually have happened earlier. Stories that appears earlier in the book might actually have appeared later. That's why the beginning of the book of Numbers start with a story that happened on the second month of the second year. And the story we are studying 3 portions later is a story that happened on the first month of the second year. It's to share with us the fact that you don't follow, the Torah is not about a book of history to record the history of Jewish people, but rather there are lessons to the Jewish people, and therefore they are organized in a different fashion and don't expect to follow a chronological order. The second answer, says Rashi, the Torah did not open with the story of Passover because the story of Passover is not about the greatness of the Jewish people. Rashi said that throughout the 40 years of the Jewish people in the desert, they had not celebrated the Passover except for this time. So this is a disgrace to the Jewish people that from 40 years they had celebrated only one time, and you don't want to begin the book of Numbers with something which is a disgrace to the Jewish people. That's Rashi. Again, according to all opinions, the first time the Jews celebrated the Passover celebration was while they were in Egypt. The second was in this story that we study, a year after they left Egypt. After that, they did not bring the Passover sacrifice, nor did they celebrate Passover for 39 years until after they entered the Holy Land. Says Rashi, that's why the Torah chose to put it much later in the book, because it's about the disgrace of the Jewish people. Tosfot, this is a collection of rabbis that lived in France in the 8th and 9th century. Tosfot says he don't understand what Rashi is telling us, quite the opposite. God commanded the Jewish people to celebrate Passover only when they enter the Holy Land. In other words, what's the disgrace? In a moment, Tosfot will explain. Tosfot said that the fact that they did not bring sacrifice of Passover throughout their life in the desert was because it was ordered by God so. God ordered them not to bring a sacrifice of Passover, except this time it was an exception. The first year after they left Egypt, it was an exception. Because God made it clear in the book of Exodus, when he gave us the commandment to celebrate, he says, when you enter the Holy Land, that's when you should bring a sacrifice. Why, however, it is a disgrace to the Jewish people, said Tosfot, is because they were supposed to enter the Holy Land immediately after they left Egypt, within 40 days. Only because, due to the story of the spies, they ended wandering in the desert for 40 years. And that prevented them from celebrating Passover for 40 years. Had they not succumbed to the evil language the spies had brought about the Holy Land, they would have entered the Holy Land 39 years earlier. And that's the disgrace that the Torah did not want to put it up in the front. Not that they didn't bring the Passover sacrifice in the desert. That was not up to them. That was God's order. The disgrace is that they were spending 40 years in the desert, therefore prevented from celebrating Passover for 39 years. Bartanura said that actually the Torah makes sure that anyone who is not uncircumcised is forbidden for bringing a sacrifice. We know that for 40 years they celebrate in the desert, they did not circumcise themselves. Right at the beginning of the book of Joshua, we read about Joshua ordering the Jewish people to circumcise themselves because they cannot enter the Holy Land without being circumcised. One of the prerequisites for celebrating Passover sacrifice is to be circumcised. Anyone who is in their family, there is a male who is uncircumcised, a child, a slave, any member of the family, that exclude the entire family from celebrating. Says the Bartanura is a sage from Italy, that they were not allowed to bring sacrifices because they did not circumcise themselves in the desert because they were traveling. And while a person is traveling, it is too dangerous for someone to circumcise himself. Therefore, they were unable to bring the Passover sacrifice. What's the disgrace? He said, the disgrace is that God created the conditions in the desert in such a way that they weren't able to circumcise themselves. Had they been faithful to God and kind and devoted to God, God would have created the conditions in the desert in such a good way that they were able to circumcise themselves and bring the sacrifice. The Rebbe is asking many questions very briefly. First question the Rebbe is asking, according to Tosfot, for 40 years, they did not celebrate Passover because they're not allowed to celebrate, as God told them only in the Holy Land they should celebrate. But the disgrace is because of the spies, they ended up for 40 years, not 40 days. Says the Rebbe, the story of the spies did not happen yet. We will discover it next week. How come Rashi is not addressing or alluding to the spies? Second question the Rebbe is asking, the fact that they could not celebrate Passover because they had to enter the Holy Land first, and the disgrace is that they wandered for 40 years in the desert, preventing them from celebrating Passover sacrifice, is not unique to the sacrifice of Passover. There were many other mitzvot, commandments they couldn't perform outside of Israel. They couldn't appoint a king. They couldn't celebrate sabbatical year. They couldn't celebrate tithing and contributions and Orlah, the prohibition of the first 3 years of the tree. There were many, many commandments that apply only upon entering the Holy Land. How come we say that the disgrace of the Jewish people is about not celebrating Passover? What about the other mitzvot that they couldn't celebrate? Therefore, says the Rebbe, the disgrace according to Rashi has nothing to do with the spies. The Rebbe is asking another question, but Tanura says it has to do with not being circumcised. The Rebbe is asking two questions. First question is, Rashi is not talking about circumcision at all. He doesn't even bring it up. Second, there was no commandment to bring a sacrifice. God said when you enter the Holy Land, so it's not to do with being circumcised. Even if they were circumcised, they were not allowed to bring. And the third question that I was asking, it doesn't make sense that within 12-month period, since they left Egypt until now, there would be so many new babies born that were uncircumcised to prevent the entire Jewish people from bringing a sacrifice. You can say some families couldn't bring because they had babies who were born, but there are many couples who did not have children, too old, too young, did not get married, and they were able to bring the Passover sacrifice. Therefore, it may not be, it's impossible that it was dependent upon the being circumcised or not. And finally, the Rebbe is asking one more question, and then we'll see what the Rebbe's explanation is. The Rebbe is asking, we already discovered that the Torah is not a history book. If it is a story about the disgrace of the Jewish people, why don't you omit the entire story? After all, not every story that happened in the desert is recorded in the Torah. So you don't want to bring it in the front because it's about the disgrace of the Jewish people. If it's about the disgrace of the Jewish people, don't even mention it. Why mention the story to remind us that that's the only time they celebrated in the desert, but the remaining 39 years they did not? And here is the way the Rebbe understands it. The Rebbe says that since the Jewish people became a nation, every book of the Torah begins with a very praiseworthy verse about the Jewish people. The book of Exodus begins with, these are the names of the Jewish people that enter the Holy Land. That's why it's called Shemot. Shemot means names. In other words, Rashi tells us right away in the book of Shemot, of the counting, that God loves the Jewish people so much that he counts them by names even after they die. Because we read about the name of the tribes and their families even after they're long dead. It's because God remembered them favorably and he loves them. The book of Leviticus, the next book, begins with Vaikra Elav Me'ol Moed. God called him from the tent of meeting. The Torah does not tell us who by name. It was Moshe, but it doesn't say God called Moshe. It says he called him. That's how the book of Leviticus begins. The Rashi tells us God loved Moshe as representing the Jewish people so much that he referred to him as him without naming him to show how close he felt to him. The book of Numbers, Bamidbar, that we study now, begins with God commanded Moshe to count the Jewish people. Rashi said he loved them so much, he counts them at every given opportunity. That's why he counts them again. Says Rashi, if it is about the love of the Jewish people and God, the book of Exodus is about how much God loved them that he counted them after they are dead. The book of Leviticus that God called them without even naming them because he loved them and he close to them. The book of Numbers is that he counted them on every given opportunity, just like someone counts his diamond and treasure. Then the question is, why start this book of Numbers with the story of counting them, where you have a better story to show how much God loves the Jewish people? You know what it is? The story of Passover in the second year, where not only God offered and asked them to celebrate Passover, but also those who are prevented turn to God and says, why should we be left out? Why shouldn't we have the opportunity to show that we follow your commandments? And God had changed the rules and added a holiday just because he loved them so much. And that's what Rashi says. This story, not because it appears in time earlier, a month earlier than the story that the book of Numbers begin. The book of Numbers starts with the second month of the second year. The story of Passover in this week's portion beginning of the first month in the second year. Just because here we can see a much deeper layer of love between the Jewish people and God. Until now, the book of Exodus and the book of Leviticus talks about God's love towards the Jewish people. The story of Passover shows us the Jewish people love towards God, that when they are prevented from a technical reason to celebrate Passover, they are complaining, how come they don't have the opportunity? And God actually breaks the rule and gives them another holiday. And that's what Rashi says. The reason is because at the same time, it's also a disgrace to the Jewish people that the next year and the year after, they did not bring the sacrifice. Of course, God ordered them not to celebrate the Passover in the desert, so they couldn't. We know that God ordered the Jewish people to celebrate Passover only in Israel. But since we read here that a bunch of people are able to change God's mind and allow them to celebrate the second Passover, How come the next year the Jewish people couldn't come to God and say, you know what? We are not in the Holy Land, but why don't you give us an opportunity? And perhaps God will allow them. And that's why God decided not to put this story at the beginning of the book of Numbers. In other words, Rashi was conflicted here. On one hand, it shows the deepest love that the Jewish people display towards God, that when God commanded them to celebrate Passover, even those that they did not apply to for technical reason were fighting for it, and actually God allowed them. On the other hand, it is the only time they were fighting. But the following 39 years, nobody bothered God asking for a change of the ruling to allow them to celebrate Passover in the desert. And says Rashi, this is the disgrace. And that's why God chose the book of Numbers to begin with the counting of the Jewish people to show how much God loved the Jews, and not the story that actually occurred a month earlier about the celebration of Passover. But to us, living here and studying this Torah portion, again, it reminds us that anytime we have a demand, especially a spiritual demand, that we would like to come closer to God, that we would like to feel godliness in our life, that we would like God to assist us in being better students and having a better understanding of the Torah, if we truly are desiring it, God will answer and find a way and create a channel for us to be able to connect and to be able to come closer and to be able to serve God in a much, much greater way than where we are. And I want to conclude this with thanking you for joining me in the study, reminding you that God willing, tomorrow morning we'll pray at 8 o'clock. Tomorrow evening at 7:30, we'll have services with social distancing and a mask. God willing, Shabbat morning, for the first time, we'll celebrate Shabbat with social distancing and a mask. And Saturday night, 9:15, we'll have a Zoom or live Facebook Havdalah with the Steinmetzes and Rebbe video on current events and current topics. And God willing, Monday morning, we'll study again via Zoom, the Talmud class. I want to wish everyone Shabbat Shalom.
Good Shabbos, Rabbi. Thank you.
Shalom, Rabbi.
Shabbat
Shalom, Rabbi.
Shalom.
Shabbat Shalom. Nice seeing you all.
Shabbat Shalom.
Shabbat Shalom.
Thank you.
Shabbat. Shalom.
Stay healthy.
Yep.
You're well. Bye, everybody.
Hi, everybody. Bye,
Hi,
everybody.
Rabbi.
Bye.
Bye, Rabbi.